Fang is an independent journalist who writes for his own very popular Substack, lifang.substack.com. Previously, he was at The Intercept and The Nation, and I'm very excited to speak with him today. Lee, thank you so much for being here.
Hey Harry, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
So, a couple of days ago, the Times of Israel announced that the Israeli Foreign Ministry will receive a new budget of $150 million. That is on top of what it gets for its already existing activities to engage in public diplomacy, what it calls public diplomacy or Hasbara. The Times notes that this sum is more than 20 times what such efforts have typically been allotted in past years. They announced that this new budget will likely focus on American college campuses and that these activities will be carried out in cooperation with American Jewish groups and the Diaspora Affairs Ministry, which will engage in what they call mass consciousness activities. The Israeli Diaspora Ministry is an organization you've spent a good amount of time covering. You and Jack Paulson published a piece in The Guardian this past summer about some of their efforts. So, what is the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs? What are their main goals? And what have been some of their major accomplishments in waging what the Diaspora Ministry itself calls mass consciousness activities?
Well, let me back up and say that there's been an effort since 2017 within various ministries of the Israeli government to kind of go above and beyond the traditional public relations budget of the Israeli government. So the Israeli government for a very long time, as you mentioned, has spent money on PR, on advertising, on kind of selling the Israeli story in the United States and Europe and in other countries, kind of push back against critics and to promote Israeli business, diplomacy, their kind of point of view, and to improve the perception of the country in various audiences. Now, there's been a discussion within some of the allies of Benjamin Netanyahu that that doesn't go far enough. And so back in 2017, there was a covert PR effort. Back then, it's gone through so many different name changes, so it's kind of difficult to brand here. But we'll call it Voices for Israel because it was initially called Killer Shlomo. It changed its name a few times. It was eventually described as a concert. It's now Voices of Israel. It initially was sheltered within a ministry called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. This was a very small ministry run by military intelligence officials, and they basically said that they wanted a strategic PR commando unit that would go in a covert way and um, change the debate. So, they were going into the United States and funding allied groups in a secret way that would lobby for anti-BDS laws. So they're basically helping enact laws that made it illegal for certain U.S. contractors and U.S. government entities to support nonviolent protests against Israeli policies with respect to the Palestinians. They were going in and working with various groups to fight what they call delegitimization, to kind of attack pro-Palestinian activists. Now, this was controversial within Israel because the group was also funding Israeli newspapers and kind of engaging in the domestic debate as well. This organization, Voices for Israel, it shuttled along to different ministries. It went from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, the Foreign Ministry, and eventually ended up in this Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. Now, fast forward to October 7th. In the days after the Hamas attack of October 7th, there was a discussion in the Knesset to reboot Voices of Israel. And, that's kind of our story, my story with Jack Paulson. There's been a kind of covert effort to revive Voices of Israel, to reinfuse it with millions of dollars and to kind of deploy it to engage in, again, this kind of cloak and dagger public relations strategies focused on the United States, focused on college campuses, focused on shaping the debate in Congress. It looks like it's also played a hand in recently passed legislation that codifies the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. This is a brand new definition of anti-Semitism that goes beyond discriminating or hating against Jews. This basically tries to redefined the term anti-Semitism to define it as certain harsh criticisms of Israel. If you call Israel a racist state, that's now defined as illegal anti-Semitism, anti as illegal as an illegal form of discrimination. You can call any other country in the world, including the United States, racist, and there's nothing in the U.S. law that says that that is illegal. That's a form of free speech. But there's this concerted attempt by pro-Israel groups, some of them backed by this Voices of Israel entity, to change the definition and kind of suppress certain forms of anti-Israel or Israel critical speech.
So I want to break those down, starting with what you mentioned about engagement on U.S. campuses. I've heard a lot over the past year about Hamas influence on campus or the influence of Iran on campus. But some of these groups that you've mentioned that are linked to the Israeli government or part of the Israeli government, like Concert being run through the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, they've been around for many years and engaged in all sorts of efforts such as anti-BDS legislation, or going against groups that are in favor of BDS on campus, surveilling and censoring them. How much money is the government of Israel pouring into American campus, and what kind of activities are they involved in there?
Well, look, we don't know the full spectrum of funding. We do see some public tenders. We really pieced together the story through a variety of documents, many of them Israeli government documents that are published in kind of not so well-known corners of the web, but still public nonetheless. Uh, we know that in the first about 7 months after October 7th, there was an infusion of about $8.2 million into reviving Voices for Israel or Concert or whatever you want to call it. And we know that this group has been allied with a certain number of think tanks and organizations in the United States. And there's a lot of overlap. Some of the staff members that helped set up Voices of Israel overlap with certain American groups that have been very active in this debate. So one of those groups is ISGAP. Um, that's the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. So, very long name. ISGAP. This is a group that has met on a almost monthly basis with members of Congress. And in fact, in in the early months of 2024, they were at a fundraiser and they took credit for the congressional hearing back in December 2023, in which House Republicans kind of grilled the leaders of elite colleges of University of Pennsylvania and famously Harvard University and accused them of fostering anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hate. And, in that kind of moment, it led to the resignation of Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, and led to, a lot of backlash against these elite colleges. ISGAP, this group that's been historically funded by Voices of Israel and has shared leadership with the Israeli government ministers and political leadership of Voices for Israel, they took credit for this PR coup of because they said they had seeded the members of Congress with their research, with their funding. They'd kind of played a jujitsu role rather than talk about Israeli government influence. They had been funding reports. Again, this is a group that's been historically funded by the Israeli government that claimed, really with no evidence, that the reason that young people around the country, particularly on these college campuses, were protesting in favor of Palestinian human rights, that they were concerned that there would be massacres in response to the October 7th um, Hamas attack, that they were only doing so because they were kind of puppeteered by Iran. Now, evidence for that claim has not emerged yet. There are a lot of people investigating this. Certainly possible, but it's not been proven. But what has been proven is that there's money coming from the Israeli government funding this think tank, ISGAP, that then coordinated these congressional hearings that kind of seeded them with research and instead placed the spotlight on these university presidents to blame them for these student protests.
I want to ask you just about a different aspect of the censorship. You worked on the Twitter files, revealing how powerful political factions like Big Pharma coordinated with big tech to censor and suppress their biggest critics. how the Pentagon collaborated with big tech in many of the same ways to censor, to blacklist, to whitelist, how the DHS collaborated with firms like Logically to counter what they called misinformation around the 2022 midterm elections. So you've been a long time observer of what has really become this broad attempt in the West by powerful factions to control and monitor the internet. That's really been a conservative grievance under the Biden administration. And many on the right have rallied around that, pronouncing their belief in free speech. To what extent does the Israeli diaspora ministry engage in those very same censorship tactics, which I've heard conservatives denouncing for the past 4 years?
The underlying argument around all of these censorship demands, whether they're from the left or the right, is that there's an attempt to kind of protect the public interest, that, inflammatory speech or any type of kind of partisan or extreme speech harms people, that election misinformation is dangerous for democracy, that hate speech harms vulnerable communities. This is what you see typically from left-wing groups that are attempting to justify censorship on social media. Well, the exact same dynamic comes to play with Israeli groups that are attempting to censor social media. There are a number of cutouts from the Israeli government, including one group that Jack Polson and I have written a lot about, Cyberwell. This is an organization that was formed from Israeli military intelligence that shares a lot of personnel and staff from Voices of Israel and the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. They came out and they created their own NGO to help advise the major social media platforms, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and others, on how to moderate content. And they make the same argument that certain forms of discussion around the Israel-Hamas war, the war in Gaza, that certain claims about the conflict, certain types of speech are dangerous forms of anti-Semitism that are going to harm people. So therefore, the social media platforms need to mass delete, mass suspend, or to moderate content based on their demands. So they claim that just using the term Zionist is a slur. Cyberwell has put out reports pressuring TikTok, basically saying that anyone who disputes the claim that 40 babies were beheaded and killed in the outset of the Hamas attack, that again, they're engaging in anti-Semitism, that they're engaging in anti-Jewish hate, even though mainstream media outlets, pretty much every neutral observer of this conflict, have debunked that lie. I mean, there were atrocities committed by Hamas, but this was not one of them. The killing of 40 babies. So, in a nutshell, this Israeli intelligence cutout, Cyberwell, which postures as a good government NGO, just there as a neutral advisor to shape the moderation policies on social media, is taking a piece of fake news, of completely fake information, of disinformation, and then forcing it into being the conventional wisdom that censors people attempting to tell the truth about what happened on October 7th. So they've been incredibly influential. They are the trusted news partners advising TikTok, and they've helped shape the policies at Facebook. So it's really the same playbook of claiming public harm, claiming that they're protecting the public interest from dangerous pieces of information, kind of wedging themselves into the content moderation policy making, and then shaping what we're allowed to see on the internet. And we've seen this from government entities funded by the Department of Homeland Security. We've seen this from the pharmaceutical industry. Now we're seeing it from the Israeli government. And the real difference here is just the partisan flip, where Democrats and liberals have tended to support some of the previous forms of censorship we've seen on social media. Now we're seeing those on the right and some Republicans support this form of censorship, even though it's bad faith, even though it's actually censoring correct and truthful information on the internet.
So you just talked about the diaspora ministry lobbying Meta and TikTok to ban certain words and phrases like Cyberwell, the offshoot of Voices for Peace, lobbying TikTok and Meta so that you can no longer say Zionists in certain contexts. And they've been successful. They've gotten new hate speech policies implemented. So if you were an American citizen, what are some of the things that you are no longer allowed to say online because of these lobbying efforts? You just mentioned one, but also, why has this group been so successful in the United States? Why is Congress so receptive to these foreign censorship efforts? And as kind of a final follow-up, in your research on censorship, have you ever encountered a foreign government that's been this successful at influencing America's free speech policies?
No, I think that many special interests and government entities attempt to shape what we read and can't read on social media and on the internet. I mean, that's how we all get our news. It's very different from just 10 years, 20 years ago. Now, particularly after the pandemic, the vast majority of Americans received their news from their smartphones, from social media. We don't watch television. We don't read the physical newspaper anymore. So if you can shape what is allowed and not allowed on social media platforms, that gives you a lot of power. So many different interest groups, many different government entities attempt to do this. Few are as successful as the Israeli government. We've seen, and it's mostly just me and Jack Polson doing this reporting, but one exception is the New York Times. The New York Times, early in 2024, discovered a foreign botnet that had flooded social media with thousands of fake Twitter accounts using artificial intelligence to create fake dialogue, to using deep fakes to create fake people, fake avatars, and they were constantly pushing anti-Muslim smears and then tweeting and Facebook messaging Democratic members of Congress to pressure them to support the Israeli point of view on the Israeli-Hamas war in Gaza. And it turns out that this was done by a PR firm that had been hired by the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. So the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, in addition to having this close relationship with Cyberwell, this good government NGO that's shaping the content moderation policies at a variety of social media platforms, they're also seeding the content that we see with fake activity, with fake users that are attempting to give the impression of authentic conversations that are in support of Israel. So Israel has a very concerted push. And I think what separates Israel from many other governments that attempt to do this, they're of course not the only government that attempts to do this. We've seen foreign botnets from Russia, from China, from Iran. Even the Thai government has done this. And typically, these botnets, these attempts to influence American legislators and American public are shut down by the Department of Justice, by the big social media platforms. They're studied by the FBI. They're alerted by members of Congress. We have congressional hearings discussing the danger of foreign influence. What's different here is that there seems to be an exception for Israel. We don't see a Department of Justice investigation of foreign influence. We don't see this talked about from our lawmakers. We don't see most of the mainstream press, with the exception of that one New York Times article, critically looking at any of these issues. Because of this maybe requires a longer conversation about the relationship between the Israel lobby and the American government and American culture. But for whatever reason, there's kind of an exception for Israel. There isn't the same amount of scrutiny.
Thank you so much for being here and helping us update this story. It's a very important one. And I hope that people go out and support your journalism, which they can find at leefang.substack.com.
Hey, thanks for having me, and it was a great conversation. Appreciate you.